There are certain evenings, now that age has softened both memory and ambition, when I find myself sitting beside a quiet fire, with no companion except the gentle ticking of the clock. On such nights, my thoughts often wander back to Baker Street, to the familiar rooms where I spent so many remarkable hours beside Sherlock Holmes. The years have carried away much that once seemed permanent. Faces have faded, voices have grown distant, and even the busiest streets of London have changed beyond recognition. Yet when I close my eyes, I can still picture those comfortable rooms exactly as they were, warmed by the glow of the fireplace, while the city murmured beyond the windows. Many people have asked me which of Holmes's investigations surprised me the most. It is never an easy question. Some cases dazzled by the brilliance of his reasoning. Others revealed unexpected kindness hidden beneath his cold manner. A few remained in my memory because they reminded me that sorrow often travels quietly, unnoticed, until it has already reached the heart. The affair of the cardboard box belongs to that last group. It began during one of the hottest summers I can remember. Even London, which usually hid beneath cool clouds and drifting fog, seemed exhausted beneath the endless sunshine. The bricks of Baker Street reflected the light until they almost shimmered before the eyes. The usual bustle of cabs and pedestrians had become slower, as though every soul in the city wished only to find shade. Our sitting room was unusually still that morning. The curtains had been partly drawn to soften the brightness, allowing only narrow beams of sunlight to stretch across the carpet. The familiar fireplace, usually alive with dancing flames, rested cold and silent for once, though it still carried the comforting scent of old oak and tobacco from cooler evenings. Holmes had stretched himself upon the sofa with remarkable contentment, reading the same letter over and over again, with that curious concentration which often suggested his mind was seeing far beyond the paper itself. As for me, I had settled into my favorite chair beside the window, with the morning newspaper resting upon my lap. The news offered little comfort. Parliament had finished its work for the season. Society had escaped the countryside or the coast. Every column seemed filled with reports of holidays, garden parties, and pleasant journeys that my own modest finances placed well beyond my reach. More than once I found myself imagining the quiet forests of southern England or the peaceful sound of waves breaking against a lonely shore. Holmes, however, never longed for such places. He often told me that while others escaped the city in search of peace, he found his own peace in remaining exactly where mysteries were most likely to appear. To him, London's millions formed a living network of tiny movements and whispered secrets. Somewhere among those crowded streets, another puzzle was always waiting, and he possessed an almost supernatural patience for waiting until it revealed itself. I admired that quality greatly. Where I often searched for comfort, Holmes searched for understanding. The newspaper soon lost what little interest it possessed, and I allowed it to slide gently onto the carpet. My thoughts wander without direction, drifting from one memory to another, as lazily as clouds crossing a summer sky. There is a curious calm that arrives during extremely warm weather. One neither sleeps nor truly thinks. The mind simply wanders wherever it pleases. Mine happened to settle upon an old portrait hanging upon our wall. It showed General Gordon, whose courage had long inspired admiration throughout Britain. From there my eyes wandered to another picture nearby, one that still awaited a proper frame. Without realizing it, I found myself imagining how much better the room would appear if the two portraits balanced one another upon the wall. That simple observation woke into older memories. I remembered conversations about famous men, distant conflicts, and the strange ways in which nations often settled disagreements through terrible violence instead of patient understanding. My own experiences as an army doctor returned briefly, bringing with them faces I had not recalled for many years. It was not an unpleasant memory. Time has a merciful habit of softening even painful recollections until they resemble faded paintings rather than living wounds. That very moment, Holmes, "You are quite right, Watson," he said quietly. "It is indeed a remarkably foolish way settling disputes." I turned toward him in complete astonishment. He had not once looked away from the letter resting upon his chest. For several moments, I simply stared. "Holmes," I finally said, "you cannot possibly know what I have been thinking." He smiled without the slightest trace of surprise. "My dear Watson," he replied gently, "your thoughts are often much clearer than you imagine." His calm amusement only deepened my bewilderment. He folded the letter carefully and placed it upon the table before sitting upright. There was no trace of mockery in his expression. Instead, he appeared genuinely pleased that another opportunity had arrived to demonstrate the careful observation upon which his remarkable methods depended. Patiently, almost like a kindly schoolmaster, he explained how each movement of my eyes had revealed the path my thoughts had followed. He had noticed me glance first toward General Gordon's portrait, then toward the unframed picture beside it. He observed my brief examination of the empty space upon the wall, and correctly guessed that I was considering how the room might appear if the arrangement were completed. From there, he continued, my attention had returned to the portrait itself. Knowing my admiration for Gordon, Holmes reasoned that I must naturally remember other great figures of the age. My changing expressions suggested thoughts of public speeches, national struggles, and eventually the terrible cost of war itself. Finally, seeing my hand drift unconsciously toward an old injury I had received years before, he concluded that my reflections had reached the strange habit mankind possesses of resolving disagreements through bloodshed. Every step sounded astonishing, yet every step proved perfectly correct. I confess, I admitted, shaking my head with quiet laughter, that your explanation is almost more extraordinary than the feat itself. Holmes merely shrugged. It is observation, Watson. Nothing more. Little did I know where Holmes's powers of observation would soon be required far more seriously. He reached once more for the letter that had occupied him throughout the morning. I have before me, he said thoughtfully, a matter which promises rather greater interest than my little demonstration. He handed me the folded newspaper. Would you kindly read a short paragraph hidden beneath the financial reports? It concerns a rather unusual parcel delivered yesterday. I searched until I found the small article. Its headline immediately caught my attention. A gruesome packet. As I began reading, the peaceful warmth of our quiet summer morning slowly gave way to the first faint shadow of a mystery unlike any we had encountered before. If you enjoy these quiet recollections of our adventures, you are always welcome to join me again for another Sherlock Holmes case. I lowered the newspaper slowly, allowing the final sentence to settle in my mind before I looked across at Holmes. The report described a curious parcel delivered to a respectable lady named Miss Susan Cushing of Cross Street, Croydon. Inside a small cardboard tobacco box, carefully packed in coarse salt, had been found 2 freshly severed human ears. The newspaper offered several possible explanations, though none appeared entirely convincing. The most popular theory suggested that some former medical students, wishing to frighten their old landlady, had stolen anatomical specimens from a dissecting room and sent them as a cruel practical joke. For several moments, neither Holmes nor I spoke. Outside, the steady rumble of carriage wheels drifted through the warm London air. Somewhere farther down Baker Street, a flower seller called softly to passing customers, while a distant church bell marked the passing hour. The ordinary sounds of the city seemed strangely peaceful beside the disturbing account I had just finished reading. Holmes accepted the newspaper from my hand and folded it neatly. "The newspapers," he observed, "must always publish something, Watson. They often discover explanations long before they possess sufficient facts." "You do not believe the story of the medical students?" He leaned back comfortably upon the sofa. "I believe nothing at all." Seeing my puzzled expression, he smiled faintly. "It is one of the first rules of investigation. Never allow a theory to arrive before the evidence. Once a man falls in love with the explanation, every fresh fact becomes a servant rather than a guide." I had heard him express similar opinions before, yet they never failed to impress me. "So," I asked, "you have formed no opinion whatsoever?" "Very little." He tapped the folded letter upon the table. "Our friend Lestrade has written asking whether I might spare a few hours. He finds the affair unusual enough to deserve another pair of eyes." Lestrade possessed many admirable qualities, but he rarely sought Holmes's assistance unless a case had resisted ordinary methods. Holmes opened the letter once more. "He writes that the Belfast post office can provide no useful information. Too many parcels passed through their hands that morning. The cardboard box offers no clue beyond having once contained half a pound of honeydew tobacco. The sender left no name. The intended recipient appears entirely respectable." He placed the letter aside. "It is exactly the sort of beginning that I enjoy." "I imagine," I said, "that Croydon is considerably cooler than Baker Street this afternoon." Holmes laughed quietly. "There speaks the practical physician rather than the detective." "In this heat," I replied, "the physician generally has the better argument." He stood and crossed toward his bedroom. "Ring for our boots, Watson. Ask Mrs. Hudson to arrange a cab. I shall exchange this dressing gown for something suitable, and then we shall discover whether Miss Cushing has truly become the victim of an unpleasant joke or something infinitely more serious." I required little encouragement. An hour spent beside Holmes upon the trail of a mystery was worth weeks of ordinary routine. The journey south proved pleasant enough, despite the weather. Dark clouds had gathered while we traveled, and before long, a gentle summer shower began to fall upon the carriage roof. The rain cooled the air wonderfully. Droplets sparkled upon the railway windows, softening the harsh sunlight until the countryside appeared fresh and peaceful once again. Holmes spoke very little during the journey. His long fingers rested lightly together, while his eyes remained half closed. Yet I knew from experience that his mind was fully occupied. Every few minutes he glanced once more at Lestrade's letter, before returning it carefully to his pocket. I occupied myself by observing the changing scenery beyond the carriage window. The crowded streets of London gradually gave way to quieter suburbs, where neat gardens bordered tidy brick houses. Children played beneath dripping trees, relieved that the heat had finally begun to fade. "There is something curious," Holmes remarked at last. "What is that?" "The sender chose the post." "Yes. He wished the parcel to arrive, naturally. But why?" I considered the question. "To frighten a lady, perhaps. To punish her, possibly. Or simply as practical joke." Holmes gave the slightest shake of his head. One must first ask why anyone would trouble to preserve the ears carefully in salt before sending them through the mail. That observation gave me pause. It had not occurred to me there is purpose behind preparation, Holmes continued. Crime often reveals itself not merely through what is done, but through the amount of care invested in doing it. Little did I know where Holmes's observations would lead. Lestrade awaited us upon the platform exactly as Holmes had predicted. He looked as energetic as ever, despite the warm afternoon. His narrow face carried an expression of determined confidence, though I fancied I detected relief at seeing Holmes step down from the train. "My dear Holmes," he exclaimed warmly, "I am delighted you came." Holmes shook his hand. "You appear hopeful." "I am." "And why is that?" "I think we already know who sent Parcel." Holmes raised one eyebrow. "Indeed. The medical students. I see. They lodged with Miss Cushing several years ago. She turned them out after repeated complaints. One of them came from Belfast." Holmes listened patiently. "It certainly sounds convenient." Lestrade nodded. "Exactly. Convenient explanations occasionally prove correct. They usually do." Holmes smiled pleasantly. "Occasionally." Lestrade laughed good-naturedly. "I suppose you will wish to examine everything yourself. I should feel rather ungrateful if I did not." "Then let us begin." Cross Street presented a picture of quiet respectability. Rows of modest brick houses stretched into the distance with remarkable uniformity. White stone steps shone from recent cleaning, while carefully tended flower boxes brightened many of the windows. Housewives chatted quietly beside open doorways as children skipped along the pavement without the slightest awareness that one particular house had suddenly become the center of police attention. It seemed impossible that anything dreadful could have touched so peaceful a neighborhood. Lestrade stopped before a neat two-story residence. "This is the place?" A young servant admitted us immediately. Miss Susan Cushing received us in her front sitting-room. She appeared to be a gentlewoman, somewhere around 50 years of age. Her gray hair was carefully arranged beneath a modest cap, and her calm blue eyes suggested years spent in peaceful domestic routine. Needlework rested comfortably upon her lap, while a basket of colored silks stood beside her chair. Nothing about her appearance hinted at excitement or secrecy. Indeed, she looked more weary than frightened. "I wish those dreadful things had never crossed my doorstep," she said quietly, before anyone else had spoken. "Surely they have caused enough trouble already. They shall not remain here much longer," Lestrade assured her. "I hope not." Holmes removed his hat respectfully. "My name is Sherlock Holmes, Miss Cushing. I regret disturbing your peace, but I wonder whether you would permit me to examine the parcel." She sighed softly. "I know nothing about it, sir." "I believe you." She looked at him with mild surprise. "The others have questioned me again and again." "I imagine they have. They seem unable to understand that I have no enemies." Holmes's voice remained gentle. "I have no wish to trouble you unnecessarily." Her expression softened. "The things are in the garden shed. I cannot bear having them inside the house." We followed Lestrade through a narrow passage into a small back garden. Rain still clung to the leaves, filling the air with the pleasant scent of damp earth. A modest wooden shed stood against the rear fence. Lestrade disappeared briefly before returning with the parcel. The brown wrapping paper had already been opened with scissors. A length of dark tarred string remained tied in its original knot around one section of the paper. Holmes did not immediately examine the contents. Instead, he lifted the string carefully between finger and thumb. "Interesting," Lestrade smiled. "Tarred twine." "Quite." Holmes raised it toward the light. and the knot as fortunately remained untouched. I noticed that. I expected as much. Without another word, Holmes turned the string slowly in his fingers, studying every fiber as though it were some rare museum specimen. What does it tell you?" I asked. "Only that whoever tied it had done so naturally." "I do not understand." "A man attempting to disguise his habits often changes his handwriting." "Yes, but very few people remember to alter the way they tie knots." He laid the string carefully upon the wrapping paper. "The scissors have cut the cord cleanly, leaving the knot exactly as the sender made it." Lestrade leaned forward. "You believe the knot itself is important?" "I believe everything is important until proved otherwise." Next, Holmes lifted the brown paper. He brought it close to his face, before inhaling, almost imperceptibly, coffee. Lestrade blinked. "Coffee? The paper has rested beside coffee beans." I had not noticed. Holmes smiled kindly. "That is why several pairs of eyes are sometimes better than one." He examined the address. "The handwriting is printed rather than written." "To disguise identity?" I suggested. "Perhaps." His finger rested upon one particular word. "Observe." I looked closely. "The town name?" "Yes." "The spelling appears rather untidy." It was corrected. Only then did I notice that one letter had originally been formed incorrectly before being altered. The writer was unfamiliar with Croydon. "So it would appear," he continued quietly. "The broad pen, poor quality ink, masculine style, limited education." Lestrade gave a low whistle. "That is a great deal from a few letters." "It is only a beginning." The yellow cardboard tobacco box came next. Holmes turned it over several times. "Half-pound honeydew. Nothing remarkable there," Lestrade observed. "No." Holmes pointed silently toward two faint impressions near one corner, thumb marks. I bent closer. Only then did I notice the shallow stains where rough fingers had once gripped the box. "They tell us little." "Not yet," Holmes replied. He gently removed the lid. Inside lay the coarse preserving salt. Carefully, almost reverently, Holmes brushed it aside. The two ears emerged once again. Even prepared as I was, I found the sight deeply unpleasant. The quiet garden, the scent of flowers after rain, and the peaceful neighborhood beyond the fence seemed strangely at odds with such dreadful evidence. Holmes remained perfectly calm. He examined each ear individually, turning them beneath the afternoon light with extraordinary care. Several minutes passed without interruption. Neither Lestrade nor I attempted to hurry him. Finally, Holmes replaced both objects inside the salt and closed the lid once more. He remained seated for a little while, his eyes fixed thoughtfully upon the small yellow box. Then he spoke. "They are not from the same person." Lestrade nodded. "I noticed that. The differences are unmistakable. You still think it may be the work of medical students?" Holmes looked up slowly. "No." His answer came so quietly that it seemed even more decisive. "No," he repeated. "This is no practical joke." The peaceful garden suddenly felt colder, despite the warmth of the afternoon. Somewhere beyond the garden wall, a carriage rolled slowly along the wet street, its wheels whispering over the damp stones. For the first time since leaving Baker Street, I felt certain that we were no longer investigating an odd curiosity. We had stepped into the shadow of a very real crime. The strangest part of the mystery was still ahead. Holmes allowed the lid of the yellow cardboard box to settle gently back into place. For several quiet moments, none of us spoke. The soft sound of rainwater dripping from the leaves overhead filled the silence, while somewhere beyond the neighboring gardens, a pigeon cooed lazily from a rooftop. It seemed extraordinary that such peaceful sounds could exist beside evidence which pointed so clearly toward violence. At length, Lestrade folded his arms. "You are quite certain?" Holmes looked up. "I rarely speak with certainty, Lestrade. In this instance, however, I feel justified. The newspapers insist it was the work of medical students." "The newspapers," Holmes replied calmly, "are welcome to their opinion." Lestrade smiled. "I confess I still find their explanation attractive." "I know. You disagree?" "I do." The detective crouched beside the garden bench and looked once more into the box. "What convinces you?" Holmes rested his hands upon his walking stick. "Several things." He spoke quietly, almost as though arranging his thoughts aloud. "In every hospital where anatomical specimens are prepared, preservation begins almost immediately. Chemicals are employed because they serve the purpose far better than ordinary salt." Lestrade nodded thoughtfully. "Quite true. These ears show no evidence of such treatment. You notice that?" "It's the first thing I examined," Holmes continued. "They are remarkably fresh." I glanced uneasily toward the closed box. "I fear you are right." "Furthermore," Holmes said, "they have been removed with a comparatively blunt instrument." "A knife?" "Very likely. Not a surgeon's scalpel?" "Certainly not." Holmes paused before adding another observation. "If students wished merely to frighten an elderly landlady, they possessed dozens of easier methods than obtaining fresh human remains." Lestrade scratched his chin. "When you put it that way, the explanation becomes increasingly improbable." The Scotland Yard inspector slowly nodded. "I admit your reasoning carries weight." Holmes smiled pleasantly. "I ask only that the evidence guide us." He reopened the box and examined the ears one final time. This time his attention rested upon details so minute that I could scarcely understand what he sought. After another minute, he carefully replaced them. "You noticed? They are not a matching pair." "Yes," Lestrade answered. "One is smaller." "More than that?" Holmes folded his hands. "The smaller ear belonged to a woman, and the larger, a man." Lestrade leaned closer. "How can you distinguish that with such confidence?" Holmes answered without the slightest hesitation. "A woman's ear is finer in structure." He pointed gently toward the closed box. "The curves are more delicate. I see. It has also been pierced for an earring." Lestrade looked surprised. "So has man's." "Exactly." That observation appeared to interest Holmes more than anything else. "A pierced ear upon a man is comparatively uncommon among respectable gentlemen. Sailors often wear earrings," I remarked. Holmes turned toward me with quiet approval. "Precisely, Watson." He looked thoughtfully toward the gray sky above the garden. "Sailors considerably more likely." Lestrade frowned. "That seems rather slight. Every fact appears slight when viewed alone." Holmes smiled. "The difficulty is learning which facts belong together." The inspector remained unconvinced. "There is still one question I cannot answer, and that is, if these truly belong to two murdered people, why should the murderer send them through the post?" Holmes nodded. "An excellent question." He began walking slowly along the narrow garden path. "I have been asking myself precisely the same thing." We followed him. "Suppose," Holmes continued, "that two people have indeed been killed." He spoke without drama, his voice remaining calm, despite the dreadful subject. "The murderer removes these ears." He paused beside a small rose bush. "He preserves them carefully." Another step. "He wraps them neatly." Another. "He addresses the parcel." He stopped. "Finally, he pays postage." Holmes turned toward us. "None of those actions occur by accident." "No," Lestrade admitted. "They require thought." "Yes, they require purpose." Holmes inclined his head. "Exactly." He looked once more toward the quiet house. So what purpose? No one answered. Holmes continued speaking more to himself than to either of us. If the parcel is intended to frighten Miss Cushing. He slowly shook his head. Then why choose this method? If it is revenge, perhaps. If it is mockery, possible. But neither explanation entirely satisfies me. He rested one hand lightly upon the garden gate. There is another possibility. Strad waited patiently. The parcel was never intended for Miss Susan Cushing at all. That suggestion surprised us both. Lestrade stared at him. You believe it was wrongly delivered? I believe it deserves consideration. But the address is correct. Quite correct. Holmes looked thoughtfully toward the sitting-room window. Yet the initials read only Miss S. Cushing. So they do. There may be more than one Miss Cushing. Lestrade considered the idea. It would explain several difficulties. But not all. Certainly not. Holmes smiled. Mysteries rarely surrender everything at once. Little did I know where Holmes's observations would lead. We returned quietly to the sitting-room. Miss Susan Cushing had resumed her needlework, though I noticed she had completed remarkable few stitches during our absence. She looked up as we entered. I hope you are finished with those dreadful things. For the present, Holmes answered gently. I shall be thankful when they leave my property forever. I can understand that, she sighed. I have scarcely known a peaceful hour since yesterday. Holmes removed his gloves before taking a chair opposite her. I should like to ask only a few questions. She nodded wearily. If they will help. I believe they may. Holmes glanced casually around the comfortable room. It contained little beyond the ordinary possessions one might expect in the home of a respectable unmarried lady. Books stood neatly arranged upon a shelf. Several framed photographs occupied the mantelpiece. Embroidery decorated the chairs. Everything reflected order, patience, and quiet domestic habits. Holmes's eyes rested briefly upon a photograph above the fireplace. He rose without a word. I had seen that expression before. Whenever some tiny observation suddenly attracted his full attention, an almost invisible change came over his face. His movements remained perfectly calm, yet every faculty seemed instantly awake. He stood studying the photograph. Three ladies sat together before the camera. Their resemblance was unmistakable. Miss Cushing followed his gaze. My sisters. Holmes smiled. I thought as much. You recognize the likeness? It is difficult to miss. She seemed faintly pleased. We were often told so when we were younger. Holmes continued examining the photograph. May I ask their names? The eldest is myself, naturally. The others are Sarah and Mary. Holmes inclined his head politely. Thank you. He returned quietly to his chair, though I noticed something unusual. For the briefest instant, genuine excitement had crossed his features. It vanished almost immediately. Only someone who had spent years beside him, as I had, could have detected it at all. Something in that simple family portrait had greatly interested him. His attention then drifted toward another framed photograph, resting upon a side table. This one showed a younger woman standing beside a strongly built man wearing a steward's uniform. Holmes picked it up carefully. This is your younger sister, Mary, and the gentleman? Her husband, I see. He is a steward. On a passenger steamer? Yes. Holmes examined the uniform thoughtfully. He appears proud of his profession. He certainly was. Miss Cushing smiled sadly. I have not seen either of them for some time. Holmes set the photograph gently back into place. Would you tell me his name? James Browner. Holmes nodded slowly. A sailor? Yes. Does he still serve at sea? As far as I know. She hesitated before continuing. He once worked upon the South American route, and now I believe he sails between Liverpool and London." Holmes's expression remained perfectly composed. "Did he visit you here?" "Only once. And your impression?" Miss Cushing folded her hands quietly. "He was a kind-hearted man." She paused. "Until drink mastered him." Holmes listened without interruption. "When sober," she continued, "there could not have been a gentler soul. And afterward, he became another person entirely." She spoke with genuine sadness rather than anger. "It broke my sister's heart." Holmes asked no immediate question. Instead, he allowed the silence to remain for several moments. Experience had taught him that people often continued speaking when not hurried. Miss Cushing did exactly that. "He loved Mary very deeply." "I'm sure he did. So deeply that he abandoned a better position simply to remain nearer home." Holmes nodded. "That suggests strong affection." It did. She sighed again. Alcohol changed everything. The quiet room seemed somehow heavier. Outside, another carriage rolled along Cross Street, while rainwater trickled gently from the gutters. "What happened?" Holmes asked softly. "He began drinking whenever he came ashore, and then he lost control of himself." "Were they unhappy?" "I fear so." She shook her head sadly. "It was a dreadful pity." Holmes spoke with remarkable gentleness. "You also mentioned your sister Sarah." At once I noticed a subtle change. Miss Cushing's pleasant expression became more reserved. "Yes, she knew Mr. Browner well, very well." "They were friends?" "For a time." Holmes waited. "Then they quarreled." "Seriously?" "I believe so." She looked toward the window. "Sarah has always possessed a difficult temper." "I understand. She could never leave matters alone." Holmes said nothing. "If something did not concern her," Miss Cushing continued quietly, "she would somehow involve herself. Nevertheless," she offered an apologetic smile, "one should not criticize one's own family." "No," Holmes agreed kindly, "but sometimes honesty requires it." Miss Cushing nodded. "Sarah lived with my sister Mary and her husband in Liverpool for quite some time." "I see." "They were very close. And afterward, everything changed." She looked thoughtfully toward the family photograph upon the mantelpiece. "I never learned every detail." "What do you know?" "Only that Sarah returned from Liverpool, no longer speaking kindly of Mr. Browner." "And Mr. Browner?" "He wanted nothing more to do with her." Holmes rested his fingertips together. "So there had been a serious disagreement." "Very serious. And your sister Mary?" A shadow crossed Miss Cushing's face. She gradually stopped writing. Holmes looked at her carefully. "Entirely?" "Yes." "Recently?" She nodded. "It has troubled me greatly." For the first time since arriving, I saw Holmes's eyes narrow slightly. The missing letters clearly interested him. Very gently, he asked one final question. "And where does Miss Sarah Cushing live now?" "At Wallington. Not far from here, only about a mile." Holmes rose immediately. "You have been extremely helpful, Miss Cushing. I fear I have told you very little." "On the contrary," he smiled warmly, "you may have helped more than you realize." As we stepped quietly from the house into the cool afternoon air, Holmes remained unusually thoughtful. At last he turned to me. "Our next visit, Watson, must be to Miss Sarah Cushing." I could not yet understand why, but experience had taught me that when Holmes followed a small thread, it often led to the heart of the entire mystery. The strangest part of the mystery was still ahead. We stepped back onto the quiet pavement of Cross Street, leaving Miss Susan Cushing to the peaceful routine from which the mysterious parcel had so suddenly drawn her. The brief shower had completely passed, and the afternoon sun now shone through scattered clouds, filling the wet pavement with a soft golden light. Tiny drops still clung to the hedges and window boxes, sparkling whenever a breeze stirred the leaves. For a short distance, Holmes walked without speaking. I had learned long ago that silence often meant his thoughts were arranging themselves into order. To interrupt him during such moments was rarely wise, and so I occupied myself by observing the pleasant suburban streets through which we passed. Croydon possessed a gentleness that differed greatly from central London. Here the houses stood a little farther apart, each with its modest front garden, white stone steps, and polished brass door knocker. Children laughed somewhere beyond a nearby fence, while the steady rhythm of a gardener's rake drifted across the still afternoon. It was difficult to imagine that somewhere within such peaceful surroundings lay the explanation for a crime that Holmes now regarded as murder. At length he broke the silence. "Well, Watson, you have discovered something." "I have." "Something important." "I believe so. You recognized it while looking at Miss Cushing?" Holmes smiled faintly. "I recognized it before I had finished looking at her. I confess that I noticed nothing unusual. I should have been surprised if you had." There was no arrogance in the remark. Holmes merely stated a fact, just as a physician might recognize the early signs of an illness, invisible to an ordinary observer. "What did you see?" I asked. He glanced at me with quiet amusement. "Her ear, my dear Holmes. It sounds absurd, I know. I fear it does." He laughed softly. I expected precisely that response. As we continued walking, Holmes folded his hands behind his back in his familiar manner. "You are aware, Watson, that no two human faces are perfectly alike." "Certainly. The same is true of ears." I considered the thought. "I have never paid them much attention. Very few people do. Yet you have, for several years." He continued speaking with the patient tone of a lecturer, addressing an interested student. "The external ear varies enormously from person to person. I had not realized that. The curve of the outer rim, the shape of the lobe, the folds of cartilage, even the angle at which it leaves the head, each possesses remarkable individuality." "You speak as though discussing fingerprints." "Very much so." He smiled thoughtfully. "I even published a short paper on the subject for an anthropological journal some years ago." The admission did not surprise me in the least. Holmes possessed an astonishing habit of becoming an authority upon subjects which most people scarcely noticed. "When I examined the female ear contained in the parcel," he continued, "I observed several unusual characteristics. And then, when I entered Miss Cushing's sitting room, I happened to glance at her profile." "You recognized the resemblance?" "Instantly." I stopped walking. "You mean?" "The ear upon Miss Susan Cushing's head and the severed female ear shared the same uncommon structure." For several seconds I could only stare at him. Surely that must be coincidence. Holmes shook his head. "No. So exact." "Remarkably so." He resumed walking. "It suggested that the unfortunate owner of the severed ear belonged to the same family." I followed beside him in thoughtful silence. "If that were true," I said at last, "then the ear belonged to one of her sisters." "Precisely, and not to Miss Susan herself." "Obviously." "Which explains why you became interested in the family portraits." Holmes inclined his head. "They immediately confirmed. There were two sisters, the initials Parcel, Miss S. Cushing. So the parcel could easily have been intended for Sarah rather than Susan." "Exactly." I found myself increasingly impressed. What had seemed little more than an unfortunate curiosity now possessed a definite direction. "It also explains," Holmes continued, "why Miss Susan appeared entirely bewildered. She knew nothing. So far as I can judge, absolutely nothing. And Sarah," Holmes's expression became thoughtful once more. Sarah almost certainly knows much more. We had reached the end of the street, where our cab still waited patiently beneath the shade of a broad tree. Lestrade joined us as the driver climbed down to adjust the harness. "Leaving already?" the inspector asked. "For the moment? You have finished with Miss Cushing?" "I believe so." Lestrade looked mildly disappointed. "I had hoped you might discover something further." "I have." "Oh?" Holmes merely smiled. "I should like to visit Miss Sarah Cushing." Lestrade blinked. "The sister?" "Yes." "What for?" Holmes opened the carriage door before answering. "Because I suspect the parcel was intended for her." The inspector looked genuinely astonished. "Good heavens!" "It is only a working theory." "But the address contains only an initial." Lestrade slowly nodded. "I had not considered that. It is easily overlooked." The detective scratched his chin thoughtfully. "Well, Sarah Cushing lives in Wallington. So Miss Susan informed us. I can take you there." "I should be obliged." The journey lasted only a few minutes. Our horse trotted steadily through quiet residential roads, lined with chestnut trees, whose leaves still glistened from the recent rain. The air felt cooler now, carrying the pleasant scent of damp grass and flowering gardens. Lestrade, seated opposite us, appeared unusually thoughtful. "I still cannot understand one thing," he admitted. "What troubles you?" Holmes asked. "If the parcel truly belonged to Sarah Cushing, why was it addressed to her former residence?" Holmes nodded approvingly. "A sensible question. I presume you have an answer." "Not yet, but you have an idea." "I have several." He gazed through the carriage window. "The simplest explanation is that the sender possessed an outdated address." "You think they had not communicated recently?" "Exactly." Lestrade considered this. "That would fit." "It would." "And if Sarah moved only a short while ago, then someone writing from another city might easily remain unaware of the change." The inspector leaned back. Holmes smiled quietly. "I find that explanations requiring the fewest assumptions often deserve attention first." Little did I know where Holmes's observations would lead. Wallington proved every bit as peaceful as Croydon. The houses were much alike, neat and comfortable, with carefully trimmed hedges and polished windows reflecting the afternoon sunlight. Our cab stopped before another modest brick home. Holmes had scarcely placed his hand upon the knocker when the front door opened. A gentleman in black stepped onto the threshold. He appeared to be about 40 years of age, clean-shaven, with intelligent features and the calm bearing of a medical practitioner. His polished hat and neatly buttoned coat completed the impression. Before Holmes could speak, the gentleman addressed us politely. "If you have come to see Miss Sarah Cushing, I regret that it is impossible." "You are her physician?" "I am." Holmes removed his hat. "My name is Sherlock Holmes." The doctor's expression softened politely. "I have heard of you, Mr. Holmes. I should be grateful for only a moment of your patient's time. I cannot permit it." He spoke kindly but firmly. "Miss Cushing is seriously ill." "Seriously?" "Very." "What is the nature of her illness?" "Severe disturbance of the brain." I noticed Holmes watching him closely. "When did it begin?" "Yesterday." "Quite suddenly?" "Very suddenly." The physician buttoned one glove as he answered. "I cannot allow visitors." "I understand." Holmes hesitated only briefly. "May I ask one further question?" "Certainly." "Was there anything in particular which seemed to bring about the attack?" The doctor paused. "I understand she received some distressing news." "I see." "It appears to have affected her profoundly." Holmes bowed. "Thank you, doctor. You are most welcome." With another courteous nod, The physician descended the front steps and disappeared along the quiet street. We remained standing silently for several moments, for after Wadey closed. No sound came from within the house. Lestrade looked disappointed. "Well, so it would seem," Holmes replied. "No interview today." "No." The inspector spread his hands. "That was unfortunate." Holmes looked thoughtfully at the upstairs windows. "On the contrary, you learned something?" "I learned a great deal." Lestrade laughed. "You always manage to do that." Holmes smiled. "It is simply a matter of paying attention." He turned away from the house. "Our visit has answered the very question I wished to ask." "What question?" "Whether Sarah Cushing understood the significance of the parcel. And now, I think there can be little doubt." As we walked slowly back toward the waiting cab, I fell into step beside Holmes. "You believe her illness is connected?" "I do, entirely." "The timings is too exact. She became ill immediately after hearing of the parcel, precisely, which suggests that she understood whom it concerned." A cool breeze stirred the branches overhead. I found myself glancing back once more at the silent house. Poor Miss Sarah Cushing remained hidden somewhere beyond those drawn curtains, struck down not by physical injury, but by terrible knowledge. "You hoped merely to see her," I remarked. Holmes nodded. "Nothing more. You believed her appearance alone might tell you something." "Usually does. And now, I must remain content with what I already possess." He paused before adding quietly, "The family resemblance was all I required." We climbed back into the cab. Lestrade looked from Holmes to me with open curiosity. "I hope you intend to explain matters eventually, when they are clearer. You already suspect someone." "I do." "Strongly?" Holmes rested his cane across his knees. "Strongly enough to continue." The inspector smiled. "I shall be delighted when you finally reveal how you reach these conclusions." "You shall." Holmes leaned back comfortably as the horse started forward once more. "But first, Lestrade, I believe we should enjoy a late luncheon." The inspector looked almost offended. "Luncheon? My mind generally works better after one." "In the middle of a murder inquiry?" Holmes chuckled. "My dear Lestrade, an empty stomach has never yet solved a mystery." Even I could not suppress a smile. It was one of Holmes' curious gifts that he could discuss the gravest matters with perfect composure, never allowing haste to replace careful reasoning. As our carriage rolled away through the quiet streets toward the town, I looked back one final time at the peaceful little house where Sarah Cushing lay hidden from a world. I had the unmistakable feeling that, although we had spoken to no one there, our brief visit had carried us much closer to the truth. The strangest revelations, however, were still waiting beyond the next turn of the investigation. Our cab rolled quietly away from Wallington, leaving behind the silent house where Sarah Cushing lay too ill to receive visitors. The afternoon had settled into that peaceful hour when the rain-washed streets reflected a gentle golden light, and even the horses seemed content to move at an easy pace. Holmes leaned comfortably against the seat, his eyes half closed beneath the brim of his hat. Anyone unfamiliar with him might easily have believed that he had abandoned the investigation entirely. I knew better. Holmes appeared most relaxed. His mind was often arranging dozens of scattered observations into a single orderly chain. Lestrade, however, was not blessed with patience. "I must confess," he said after several minutes, "that I am more puzzled now than when we began." Holmes smiled faintly, without opening his eyes. "Excellent." The inspector blinked. "Excellent. Confusion is often the first step toward understanding. I should much prefer certainty, as would we all. Holmes turned slightly toward him. The difficulty lies in distinguishing certainty from assumption. Spratt laughed quietly. You always manage to make the matter sound far more complicated than I expect. On the contrary, Holmes looked out through the carriage window. My aim's always to make complicated matters appear simple. We soon reached a respectable hotel near the town center, where Holmes proposed that we take a late luncheon before visiting the police station. The dining room overlooked a small public garden where children played beneath dripping trees while their parents occupied shaded benches. Through the open windows drifted the pleasant scent of wet earth and freshly cut grass. The peaceful surroundings formed a curious contrast to the subject occupying our thoughts. Holmes ordered a modest meal and seemed perfectly content to speak of almost anything except the investigation. He asked the waiter about the local weather. He admired the quality of the bread. He even spent several minutes discussing violins for violins after noticing an engraving formations. Strad finally set down his knife. My dear Holmes, yes. Do you intend to torture me much longer? Holmes looked genuinely surprised. Torture you? You have plainly discovered something important. I have discovered several things. And yet, you discuss violins. Holmes smiled warmly. My appetite generally improves after mental exertion. It does not improve mine. I could not help laughing. The inspector shook his head with good humor. I sometimes wonder how you ever solve anything. Holmes buttered another piece of bread before replying. By refusing to hurry. Once our meal had been cleared away, Holmes finally became more serious. He rested his hands upon a table and spoke quietly. Let us review what we know. Lestrade immediately leaned forward. We have a parcel. Yes. Contains 2 human ears. Correct. They belong to a man and a woman. Precisely. They were recently removed. Indeed. Holmes nodded approvingly. So far we stand upon firm ground. The parcel was posted from Belfast. Yes. It arrived at the home of Miss Susan Cushing. So it appeared. Lestrade corrected himself. Or perhaps it was intended for Sarah. I believe so. And Sarah becomes violently ill immediately after hearing about it. Holmes inclined his head. Exactly. The inspector looked thoughtful. She understood something. I think she understood everything. Those words hung quietly between us. Lestrade spoke again. But there remains the greatest mystery. Which? The reason. Holmes folded his hands. Yes. Why send the ears? An excellent question. If a murderer wished to hide his crime, why announce it? Holmes looked toward the garden beyond the window. I have considered only one explanation that satisfies me, and that is, the parcel was never intended to confess. Lestrade frowned. I do not follow. It was intended to communicate. Communicate what? Holmes answered softly. A message. A message. To one particular person. He paused. Not to the police, not to the newspapers, not even to Miss Susan Cushing, only to Sarah. The inspector remained silent. Holmes continued. A message requiring no words. I felt a slight chill despite the warm afternoon. You mean, the sender believed Sarah would immediately understand. Lestrade considered this carefully. Then Sarah must know both the sender and the victims. I believe she does. And yet she has told us nothing. She has been physically unable. You accept the doctor's opinion? Entirely. Holmes' expression grew thoughtful. I have no reason to doubt his honesty. Nor I. The attack appears genuine. Holmes looked down at the polished table. Indeed. I suspect that no ordinary shock could have produced such an effect. What sort of shock, then? The sudden confirmation of one's darkest fears. No one spoke for several moments. Outside, carriage wheels rolled slowly past the hotel, mingling with the cheerful voices of children playing in the garden. At last Holmes rose. "I believe we have delayed long enough." "The police station?" Lestrade asked. "Yes." He settled his hat upon his head. "I am expecting a reply to a telegram that immediately caught my attention." "You sent one while we travel from Croydon." "I did." "I wondered whom you had written." Holmes smiled. "A trusted acquaintance in Liverpool. What information did you request?" He answered as we stepped into the street. "I asked two very simple questions, and they were, whether Mrs. Browner remained at her home, and in the second, whether James Browner had recently sailed aboard his vessel." I looked at him in surprise. "You already suspected Browner before leaving Miss Susan?" "I considered him worthy of investigation." "Because he was a sailor?" "Among other reasons. Little did I know where Holmes's observations would lead." The Croydon police station stood only a short walk away. It was a solid brick building whose plain exterior reflected the practical nature of its purpose. Constables moved quietly about their duties, while clerks carried bundles of papers between adjoining offices. Lestrade led us directly inside. A young officer immediately approached. "A telegram arrived a short while ago, sir." "For Mr. Holmes?" "Yes." He handed over the folded message. Holmes thanked him, broke the seal, and read the contents with remarkable speed. I watched his face closely. There was no surprise, only quiet satisfaction. He folded the telegram neatly and slipped it into his pocket. "Excellent." Lestrade could restrain himself no longer. "What does it say?" "Exactly what I hoped." "You cannot leave it at that." The inspector's eyes widened. "And Browner?" "He sailed aboard the Mayday." Lestrade stared at him. "Good heavens!" Holmes continued calmly. "The vessel is expected to reach London tomorrow evening." The inspector's face slowly brightened. "You believe he's our man?" "I do." "So strongly?" "Strongly enough that I should advise preparing to meet the ship." Lestrade drew a deep breath. "Without questioning anyone else?" "I believe further questioning here would accomplish very little." The inspector remained silent for nearly a minute. Finally, he spoke. "If you are correct." Holmes waited. "Then everything changes." "It does." Practical joke disappears. Entirely. Medical students disappear. Completely. I fear so. Lestrade looked almost reluctant to accept it. "Our task is not to choose the most comforting answer. It is to discover the true one." "Exactly." The inspector led us into his small office, where several maps covered one wall, and official reports lay stacked neatly across a broad desk. He closed the door behind us. "I should like your opinion." Holmes nodded. "Certainly." Lestrade lowered his voice. "If Browner truly sent the parcel." "Yes." "Why did he send it from Belfast?" Holmes walked slowly toward the map hanging beside the window. He traced one finger across the Irish Sea. "The answer lies in his occupation." He pointed first to Liverpool. "His ship departs, then to Belfast. It calls here, finally toward London, and ultimately arrives in the Thames." Lestrade nodded. "He simply posted the parcel at the first convenient port." "Precisely." "The voyage itself explains everything." Holmes smiled. "It explains far more than one might imagine." The afternoon sunlight slanted through the office window, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Holmes stood quietly before the map for several moments. Then he turned toward Lestrade. "I suggest that tomorrow evening you meet the Mayday as she docks." "You expect no resistance?" "I cannot say." "You think Browner knows he is suspected?" "I doubt it." "He may attempt escape." "He may." Lestrade reached for a notebook. "I shall arrange sufficient officers." Holmes nodded approvingly. "I believe that would be wise." The inspector hesitated. "And if he refuses to speak?" Holmes looked at him thoughtfully. "I rather think he will." "You do?" "There are crimes which a man commits with his hands." He paused before continuing. "And there are crimes which continue afterward inside his own mind." The room grew very still. "I suspect James Browner has already begun serving the greater part of his punishment." I did not yet understand the full meaning of Holmes's words, but something in his quiet certainty convinced me that he was looking beyond evidence and deduction. He was looking into the heavy burden carried by a guilty conscience. As we prepared to leave the station and begin our journey back toward Baker Street, I could not escape the feeling that Holmes already saw the entire tragedy laid out before him, though many details still remained hidden from me. The complete truth, however, had not yet been revealed. That solemn revelation still awaited us. As the evening train carried us steadily back toward London, the golden light of the afternoon slowly faded into softer shades of amber and gray. Beyond the carriage window, quiet fields slipped past one after another, interrupted now and then by clusters of cottages whose chimneys sent thin streams of smoke into the peaceful sky. Holmes had settled into the corner opposite me with his traveling rug across his knees. He appeared entirely at ease. The excitement that usually accompanied a difficult investigation was absent. Instead, there rested upon his features a thoughtful seriousness that I had seen only during cases involving deep human sorrow rather than clever criminal schemes. For some time, neither of us spoke. The gentle rhythm of a train, together with the cooling evening air entering through the half-open window, created an atmosphere that invited quiet reflection rather than conversation. At last I broke the silence. "You seem unusual certain." Holmes lifted his eyes. "In what respect?" "That James Browner is responsible. I believe the evidence points strongly toward him." "And yet we have never met the man." "No, we have no confession. Not yet. No witnesses. None that we know." I leaned forward. "Then what gives you such confidence?" Holmes rested his hands together. "The chain, Watson. The chain. Every fact links naturally to the next." He spoke slowly, almost as though arranging each observation before us. "Consider where we began. With the parcel." "Exactly. A tobacco box, wrapped in brown paper, tied with tarred twine." Holmes nodded. "Tarred twine, commonly found aboard ships." I remembered our examination in Miss Cushing's garden. "The knot also interested you." "It did. A sailor's knot." "So it appeared." He continued. "Next came the man's ear. The pierced ear." "Yes." "You suggested that sailors often wear earrings." Holmes smiled faintly. "I merely observed that the custom is far more common among seamen than among other professions." "And then we discovered that Mary Cushing's husband was himself a Seward." "Precisely." The pieces now fitted together with increasing clarity. "It may appear obvious in retrospect," Holmes continued, "but good reasoning should always appear obvious once the entire path has been traveled." The train slowed briefly as it passed through a small station before gathering speed once more. Outside, the first gas lamps of evening had begun appearing beside quiet village roads. I turned again toward Holmes. "What first made you doubt the medical student theory?" He answered immediately. "It explained too little." "In what way?" "It required us to believe that former lodgers had somehow obtained 2 fresh human ears." "True." "They then carefully preserved them." "Yes." "They wrapped them neatly." "Indeed." "They paid postage." I smiled. You return again to the postage. It is central. Why? Because mailing the parcel required planning. He looked thoughtfully toward the darkening countryside. Practical jokes thrive upon speed. I nodded. Planning suggests purpose. Exactly. And purpose demands explanation. Holmes removed his pipe from his pocket, but did not light it. He simply turned it thoughtfully between his fingers. There is another matter. The ears? The woman herself. I looked puzzled. What about her? The ear? The family resemblance? Yes. He smiled quietly. You remember how surprised you appeared. I was. Most people underestimate how distinctive ears truly are. I confess I was among them. You are not alone. Holmes looked out the window once more. When I recognized the similarity between Miss Susan and a female ear, the entire direction of the inquiry changed, because it became a family matter. Precisely. No stranger could have revealed that. No. And from there, everything naturally led toward the sisters. For several minutes we simply watched the countryside pass. A flock of birds crossed the fading sky, while distant church towers appeared briefly before disappearing behind clusters of trees. The peaceful landscape reminded me how often terrible events unfolded beneath perfectly ordinary skies. Holmes seemed to read my thoughts. Crime rarely announces itself dramatically. No. It often grows quietly. Like a disease, he inclined his head. A useful comparison. As physicians, we learn that symptoms may appear long after the illness has begun. Holmes smiled. So it is with many investigations. Little did I know where Holmes's observations would lead. He reached Baker Street shortly after dusk. The familiar glow of gas lamps welcomed us. As our cab stopped before number 221B, Mrs. Hudson greeted us with their usual kindness. I hope you have both had a successful day. Holmes smiled. Moderately successful. She accepted our coats. Shall I light the fire? Please. Although the evening remained warm, there was something comforting about the familiar crackling of flames within our sitting room. Before long, we were once again seated beside the fireplace, where gentle shadows danced across the walls, exactly as they had on so many previous evenings. The violin rested upon its usual chair. Chemical apparatus occupied one corner of the room. My medical books stood neatly arranged upon their shelves. After the long day in Croydon, the familiar surroundings felt wonderfully peaceful. Holmes filled his pipe at last. Blue smoke curled slowly upward, while he stretched comfortably in his armchair. The case, he said thoughtfully, reminds me of two earlier investigations. Which ones? A Study in Scarlet and The Sign of Four. I smiled. I remember them rather well. In each instance, we reasoned backward, from effect to cause. Exactly. He tapped the bowl of his pipe lightly. Many investigators begin with theories and then search for evidence, which is dangerous. You prefer the reverse? I prefer allowing the evidence to construct the theory. He leaned back. The parcel was the effect, and the crime? The cause. I reached for my notebook almost unconsciously. Whenever Holmes entered one of these reflective moods, valuable lessons often followed. You once told me, I said, that nothing is more deceptive than an obvious fact. I did. I understand it better now. Do you? The obvious explanation pointed toward medical students. Yes, but the obvious evidence pointed elsewhere. Holmes smiled approvingly. You are improving, Watson. I owe the improvement to long practice. Practice remains the finest teacher. The fire burned quietly between us. Outside, occasional carriage wheels echoed along Baker Street before fading once more into silence. Holmes spoke again. There is one matter still missing. The complete story. Exactly. We know the likely criminal. Yes, we know the probable victims, one certainly. And the other? Holmes' expression grew thoughtful. The second victim interests me greatly. You mean the man? Yes. We know almost nothing about him. Not yet. Holmes folded his hands. But I suspect that Browner himself will soon supply every missing detail. I looked curiously toward him. You expect a confession? I do. What makes you so certain? Holmes answered without hesitation. His choice of message? The ears? Yes. A man wishing to conceal his crime would have hidden every trace. Naturally, Browner instead preserved evidence to send to Sarah. Exactly. Holmes' voice remained calm. He wished someone to know. Why? Because grief often seeks an audience. I reflected upon those words. It seems an unusual motive. It is deeply human. Holmes stared quietly into the fire. There are criminals driven by greed, others by hatred, some by fear. He paused, and a few by overwhelming emotion. The room fell silent. The fire gave a soft crackle as another log settled. After some minutes, Holmes rose and crossed toward his writing desk. He selected a sheet of stationery and began composing a brief letter. To Lestrade? Yes. What are you telling him? Only to meet the Mayday tomorrow evening. You remain certain of its arrival. I verified the vessel's schedule before sending my telegram. He finished writing and sealed the envelope. I have also asked him to forward Browner's statement immediately, should an arrest be made. You anticipate one? I do. He smiled faintly. And I suspect the statement will prove unusually complete. The remainder of the evening passed quietly. Holmes eventually exchanged his correspondence for his violin, drawing from it several gentle melodies blended perfectly with the peaceful atmosphere of our sitting room. I settled into my chair with a medical journal upon my lap, though I confess I read very little. My thoughts continually returned to the little yellow cardboard box, to the quiet home in Croydon, to poor Miss Susan Cushing, whose peaceful existence had been shattered without warning, to Sarah Cushing, lying ill after recognizing the dreadful meaning hidden within the parcel. Most of all, I wondered about James Browner. Who was this sailor? What chain of events had transformed an apparently devoted husband into a man capable of such terrible act? Holmes, as though sensing my thoughts without my speaking them aloud, lowered his violin. Tomorrow, he said quietly, I believe we shall hear a very unhappy story. His words lingered in the warm glow of the fire. Outside, London settled gradually into the stillness of night, while somewhere upon the dark waters approaching the Thames, the steamship Mayday continued its steady journey toward home. Aboard that vessel traveled but one man who could finally reveal the truth hidden behind the mysterious cardboard box. The most sorrowful chapter of the case was about to begin. 2 quiet days passed, for the final pieces of the mystery began to fall into place. London had settled back into its familiar rhythm. The summer heat had eased, and gentle evening breezes drifted through Baker Street whenever Mrs. Hudson opened the windows. Holmes occupied himself with several small inquiries that scarcely deserved mention, while I resumed my medical reading and paid visits to a few former patients. Yet beneath our ordinary routine remained the quiet expectation that news would soon arrive. Holmes never mentioned the matter unless I asked. His confidence remained unchanged. The Mayday will reach the Thames, he said simply. Lestrade will be waiting. Nothing more. It was characteristic of him. Once he believed his deductions complete, He never wasted energy upon speculation. The evidence would either confirm his reasoning or correct it. Late on the second afternoon, while Holmes was arranging several chemical bottles upon the corner table, Hudson entered carrying a large envelope. "For you, Mr. Holmes." He looked up at once. "Thank you, Mrs. Hudson." The envelope bore the official markings of Scotland Yard. Holmes examined the handwriting for only a moment before smiling quietly. "Lestrade, so soon?" I asked. I expected no delay. He broke the seal carefully. Several closely typed pages slipped into his hand, together with a short handwritten note. Holmes read the first page silently. Then he gave a slow nod. "As I suspected. You have news?" "We have everything." He handed me the brief note before returning to the larger document. It read, "My dear Mr. Holmes, Browner has been arrested exactly as you predicted. He offered no resistance and has made a complete statement. I enclose the official transcription for your interest. Your deductions have again proved entirely correct. Yours faithfully, G. Lestrade." I looked up. He confessed? Completely. Holmes settled into his familiar armchair beside the fireplace. He requested permission to tell the entire story. The fire burned gently despite the mild evening, filling the room with its comforting glow. Outside, carriage wheels rolled steadily along Baker Street, while somewhere nearby a newspaper seller called the evening edition. Holmes adjusted the pages upon his lap. "I think," he said quietly, "that you should hear his own words." He began reading. The statement had been taken shortly after Browner's arrest, aboard the Mayday. According to Lestrade's company note, the steward had surrendered without the slightest struggle. He had simply extended both hands for the handcuffs before the officers even requested them. That detail struck me deeply. There was resignation rather than fear. Holmes looked briefly over the first paragraphs before setting the pages aside. "I shall summarize the beginning," he said. "The official language is unnecessarily repetitive." I nodded. "It will read better that way." He leaned back comfortably. "Imagine, Watson, a broad-shouldered sailor seated alone upon a sea chest inside his small cabin. His voice remained calm, almost reflective. He has scarcely slept since the crime. The officers enter. He looks up. Instead of resisting, he quietly says, 'I have much to tell.'" Holmes folded his hands. That single sentence tells us a great deal. It suggests relief. "Precisely," Holmes continued. "Browner explained that punishment no longer concerned him. He expected execution. He believed he deserved whatever the law might decide. Then why confess?" Holmes answered softly, "Because silence had become unbearable." The room grew very still. He told the officers that he no longer feared prison. What did he fear? His own memories. Holmes looked thoughtfully into the fire. He said that whenever he closed his eyes, two faces appeared before him. I felt an involuntary shiver. The victims, yes, they never left him. Holmes spoke with quiet sympathy. He described them, not with hatred, but with sorrow. For a little while, Holmes remained silent before continuing. "The statement, then, turns backward. To explain everything?" "Exactly. He begins long before the murders." Holmes rested the papers upon his knee. James Browner had once been, by every account, an honest and hard-working steward. He loved his wife deeply. They were genuinely happy. Holmes smiled sadly. "Indeed, I believe they were happier than many married couples I have known." "What changed?" He answered with a single word. "Sarah." I leaned forward. "Miss Sarah Cushing?" "The same." Holmes resumed. "The three sisters differed greatly from one another." He counted quietly upon his fingers. Susan, the eldest, peaceful and kind. Yes, Mary, the youngest, gentle, affectionate, trusting. At Sarah, Holmes paused. Intelligent, another pause. Proud. And unfortunately, he looked down at the pages, possessed of passions she could neither govern nor abandon. The atmosphere in our sitting room seemed noticeably heavier. Outside, evening shadows had begun gathering across Baker Street. Holmes explained that Sarah had traveled to Liverpool to live with her younger sister and brother-in-law. At first, nothing disturbed their household. James Browner continued sailing regularly. Mary managed their comfortable home. Sarah became almost another member of the family. "It sounds perfectly ordinary," I observed. "So it did." Holmes nodded. "That is often how tragedy begins," he continued. During Browner's frequent visits home between voyages, Sarah gradually developed feelings she should never have encouraged. For her own sister's husband, yes. Did Browner realize it? Not at first. Holmes smiled faintly. He appears to have been remarkably innocent. Eventually, however, Sarah made her feelings unmistakably clear. Holmes did not dwell upon the details. Instead, he described the incident simply. One afternoon, Mary had stepped briefly from the house. Browner returned unexpectedly. Sarah found herself alone with him. He paused. She revealed far more than she intended. And Browner? He immediately understood. What did he do? Exactly what an honorable husband ought to do. Holmes looked directly at me. Gently but firmly rejected her. I breathed a quiet sigh of relief. That must have ended it. Holmes slowly shook his head. No. It began. According to Browner's statement, Sarah left the room almost immediately. She neither argued nor protested. She simply smiled in a manner that troubled him deeply. From that day onward, everything changed. Not openly, not suddenly, but quietly, patiently, almost invisibly. Holmes lowered the pages. There are few things more dangerous than resentment concealed beneath outward calm. You believe Sarah concealed hers. I think Browner's account leaves little doubt. She sought revenge, yes. Not through violence, no, through influence. Holmes inclined his head. A far subtler weapon. Over the following months, Sarah gradually poisoned Mary's peace of mind, not with obvious lies, not with dramatic accusations, but with countless small suggestions, small doubts, small questions, tiny uncertainties that slowly grew into lasting suspicion. Did Browner know? He remained almost entirely unaware. He believed his wife's change was natural. Precisely. Holmes sighed quietly. Poor fellow. He could not understand why Mary's cheerful nature gradually disappeared. I found the story profoundly sad. It possessed none of the cleverness usually associated with Holmes's investigations. Instead, it revealed the slow destruction of ordinary happiness. Holmes turned another page. Eventually, Browner himself began drinking again. He had previously stopped for quite some time. The strain drove him back. Holmes nodded. So he claimed. He admitted full responsibility for that weakness. He blamed no one. No. He simply acknowledged that alcohol steadily made matters worse. The fire crackled softly between us. Holmes remained thoughtful. There is a lesson there. What lesson? That several small faults, left unchecked, often unite to create one overwhelming disaster. Little did I know where Browner's confession would soon lead. The evening had grown noticeably darker. Mrs. Hudson quietly entered to light another lamp before leaving us once more in peaceful silence. Holmes gathered the remaining pages. The next part of Browner's confession, he said gravely, introduces another man. A man? Yes. He unknowingly became the final spark, the last link in a chain that had already been forged. Holmes looked solemnly into the fire. From this point onward, the story moved steadily towards the dreadful events upon the water. He rested the confession gently upon the table. And there is very little happiness remaining. The most heartbreaking chapter of James Browner's story was still to come. Holmes sat quietly for several moments before continuing. The dancing glow of the fireplace reflected softly across the pages of James Browner's confession, while beyond our windows the familiar sounds of Baker Street had gradually faded into the calm of evening. The room seemed wrapped in that peaceful silence which so often accompanied Holmes when a case turned from deduction toward reflection. He adjusted the papers upon his knee. "What follows," he said, "is no longer the account of a mystery." I looked toward him. "It is the story of a family slowly coming apart." He spoke with unusual gentleness. "There are no sudden villains here, Watson. No? Only ordinary people, making one poor decision after another. According to Browner's own statement, life within his Liverpool home became steadily more unhappy. His wife Mary, once cheerful and trusting, had changed almost beyond recognition. She questioned every delay, every unexpected journey, every letter that arrived, every explanation he offered. Small disagreements gradually became daily arguments. Holmes paused. Browner admitted that he could not understand the change. He blamed himself? Partly. He also blamed drink, quite openly. Holmes looked thoughtfully into the fire. He never attempted to excuse that weakness. The steward confessed that after long voyages he increasingly turned toward alcohol whenever he came ashore. It did not solve his troubles. It merely deepened them. The more he drank, the less patient he became. The less patient he became, the more frightened Mary grew. And the more frightened she became, the more suspicious she became in return. It was a sad circle from which neither seemed able to escape. At this stage, Holmes continued, Sarah had already left their house. I thought that might improve matters. So did Browner. But it did not. Holmes slowly shook his head. Sarah remained close enough to continue influencing events. She had rented rooms only a short distance away. Sailors frequently lodged there, while their ships remained in port. Mary visited her sister often, sometimes for tea, sometimes simply for conversation. Browner believed those visits harmless. Only later did he realize how much time the two sisters spent together discussing him. Did Mary still love him? I asked. Holmes answered without hesitation. I believe she did. Then why mistrust him? Because trust can be slowly worn away. He folded one page of the confession. A single accusation may be rejected, but many small suggestions can eventually become convictions. I found that observation deeply melancholy. As a physician, I had often seen illness weaken the strongest body, little by little. Now I was hearing of suspicion weakening an equally strong marriage. Holmes continued reading. One day, another visitor entered their lives. His name was Alec Fairbairn. The name itself meant nothing to me. Holmes noticed my expression. Browner describes him in some detail. He glanced briefly at the page. An experienced seaman, way-traveled, pleasant in conversation, exceptionally charming. The detective laid the papers aside for a moment. There are certain people who possess the effortless ability to make friends wherever they go. I have known a few. So had Browner. Did he distrust Fairbairn immediately? Quite the opposite. Holmes smiled sadly. He welcomed him. According to the confession, Fairbairn first appeared as little more than another acquaintance for Sarah Cushing. He visited her lodging frequently. Before long, he also became welcome in Browner's own home. He spoke entertainingly of distant ports. He had traveled widely. He possessed polished manners, unusual among sailors. His stories amused everyone. Even Browner admitted that he found the man pleasant company. For several weeks, nothing appeared unusual. The four of them spent agreeable evenings together. Whenever Browner happened to be ashore, Mary laughed more often. Conversation returned to the house. For a brief time, the old happiness almost seemed ready to return. Holmes looked at me quietly. It is often the calmest period that immediately precedes a storm. Little did I know where Browner's confession would lead. The confession then described a seemingly insignificant moment. Holmes read it slowly. One afternoon, Browner returned home unexpectedly. As he entered the sitting room, his wife looked toward the doorway. For the briefest instant, her face lit with unmistakable delight. Then, seeing that it was her husband rather than the person she had expected, that expression faded almost immediately. She attempted to hide her disappointment, but Browner had already seen it. Holmes lowered the page. One glance. That was enough? For him, yes. Why? He immediately asked himself whom she had expected. And he found only one answer: Alec Fairbairn. Neither of us spoke. The crackling of the fire seemed unusually loud within the quiet room. From that day onward, Browner's peace disappeared. He watched. He wondered. He doubted. Yet he still possessed no proof. Holmes resumed. He describes himself almost as two different men. When sober, he wished to trust Mary, and when drinking, every suspicion appeared certain. The detective sighed softly. At other times, he blamed Fairbairn. Occasionally, he blamed Sarah. His emotions shifted as rapidly as the tides upon which he spent his working life. One evening, everything changed. Browner entered the house and found Fairbairn visiting once again. Nothing improper occurred. No argument followed. Yet the sight itself seemed unbearable. Holmes read quietly. Browner ordered that Fairbairn should never again enter his home. His voice remained firm. He offered no lengthy explanation. He simply refused to receive him further. What happened? I asked. Sarah defended Fairbairn. I expected as much. She declared that if her friends were unwelcome, then she herself would also leave. And she did, that very evening. Holmes paused before continuing. As she departed, Browner uttered words he would later remember with terrible regret. What words? He declared that if Fairbairn ever returned, he would send Sarah one of the man's ears. A chill passed through me. The dreadful parcel suddenly assumed a darker significance. Holmes noticed my reaction. You see now why the ears were sent. I nodded slowly. They fulfilled an old threat. Exactly. Not merely evidence, but a message. Sarah moved into lodgings of her own. Fairbairn continued visiting her. Mary also continued calling upon her sister. Browner attempted to forbid those visits. His wife obeyed for a short while. Then she resumed them. At last he followed her one afternoon. Holmes read the next passage carefully. Browner reached Sarah's house quietly. As he approached, Fairbairn noticed him first. The man escaped through the rear garden before Browner entered the house. Mary remained behind. She was pale. She trembled, visibly. Browner led her home without violence, but whatever affection had once united them had become deeply wounded. He still loved her? I asked. Holmes answered immediately. I believe he loved her until the very end. Then why threaten her? Because jealousy rarely speaks with reason. The detective stared thoughtfully into the flames. He became a prisoner of his own suspicions. The confession continued. Sarah eventually failed to make a successful living from her lodging house. She left Liverpool. Returning south, she went to live with her sister Susan in Croydon. From there, she continued corresponding with Mary. Browner knew very little of those letters. He merely noticed that his wife's behavior never returned to what it had once been. Meanwhile, his own drinking grew steadily worse. Every voyage seemed longer. Every return home brought fresh unhappiness. The peaceful marriage, remembered with such affection, had become little more than silence interrupted by quarrels. Holmes gently placed the confession upon the table. It is impossible to say precisely where blame begins. No, Browner drank. Yes, Sarah interfered. Indeed, Mary trusted the wrong advice. Holmes nodded. And Fairbairn remained where wisdom should have sent him elsewhere. The tragedy had become almost inevitable, not because of one great evil, but because many smaller failings slowly gathered together until none of those involved could escape their consequences. Holmes picked up the remaining pages. Only one final voyage remained. He spoke quietly. The voyage that changed everything. He looked toward me with unusual solemnity. When Browner unexpectedly returned home before schedule, he believed fortune had granted him a pleasant surprise. Instead, he found the sight that shattered whatever hope still remained within him. The next chapter of his confession would carry us to the railway station, the sea, and finally into the lonely waters where the fate of Mary Browner and Alec Fairbairn would be decided. The saddest moments of the entire story were now close at hand. Holmes remained silent for a long while before continuing with the final pages of James Browner's confession. The room around us had grown wonderfully still. The fire burned low upon the grate, casting a warm amber glow across the familiar furniture of Baker Street. Outside, London settled into the quiet hours of evening. The occasional sound of distant carriage wheels drifted faintly through the open window before disappearing once more into silence. At last, Holmes unfolded the remaining sheets. "The final voyage," he said softly, "began like many others." He glanced toward me. Browner had expected to be away for a full week, but fate intervened. The Mayday had scarcely completed the early stage of her journey when an accident aboard the vessel forced the captain to return briefly to Liverpool. One of the ship's cargo fittings had shifted unexpectedly, making repairs necessary before continuing the voyage. The delay was expected to last only a few hours. To Browner, however, it appeared an unexpected gift. He had not informed Mary that he would return. Instead, he imagined surprising her with an unexpected visit before sailing once more. Holmes lowered the pages for a moment. It is remarkable how often tragedy enters through what first appears to be good fortune. I nodded quietly. He intended only to see his wife, so he claimed. And I believe him. According to the confession, Browner left the docks in excellent spirits. As he walked through the familiar Liverpool streets, he pictured Mary's surprise when she opened the door. Perhaps, he hoped, the weeks of unhappiness might finally begin to fade. Perhaps they might speak honestly. Perhaps the old affection still survived beneath all their misunderstandings. Those simple hopes accompanied him until he turned to his own street. There everything changed. A cab rolled slowly past. Inside sat Mary. Beside her sat Alec Fairbairn. They appeared entirely absorbed in cheerful conversation. Neither noticed Browner standing motionless upon the pavement. Holmes paused. Browner writes that, in that single instant, he ceased to be master of himself. The detective spoke those words without approval or excuse, as part of the man's own account. For several moments, neither Holmes nor I spoke. The image required no embellishment. A husband unexpectedly returning home, a passing carriage, one brief glance, a lifetime altered forever. Holmes resumed reading. Browner admitted that drink, accumulated suspicion, wounded pride, and sudden jealousy overwhelmed every remaining trace of reason. He described the sensation not as anger alone, but as confusion. His thoughts became disordered, his heart raced. The world around him seemed strangely unreal, yet one purpose remained perfectly clear. He would follow them, even well behind the cab. Browner hurried through the busy streets until the carriage reached the railway station. A crowd had gathered before the ticket office. Passengers hurried in every direction, while railway porters pushed carts piled high with luggage. Within that confusion, Browner remained unnoticed. He watched Mary and Fairbairn purchase their tickets. Then he quietly bought one for himself. They were traveling to New Brighton. He entered another carriage several compartments behind them. Throughout the journey, they never once realized he followed. Holmes looked thoughtfully toward the fire. Chance continued favoring him. In what way? I asked. He might easily have lost sight of them, but he did not. No, every circumstance drew him closer. When the train reached the coast, Mary and Fairbairn left the station together. Browner followed at a careful distance. The afternoon had grown unusually warm. Visitors filled the promenade overlooking the sea. Families walked leisurely beside the water. Children played upon the sand. Pleasure boats drifted peacefully across the bay. Everything suggested a pleasant summer afternoon. Nothing hinted at the sorrow that would soon unfold. Holmes continued quietly. The two walked for some time. They appeared perfectly unconcerned. Browner remained behind them. He never approached, not yet. Instead, he simply watched. His emotions grew steadily darker with every passing minute. Eventually, Mary and Fairbairn hired a small rowing boat. The weather encouraged many visitors onto the water. A light haze rested over the bay, softening the distant shoreline, until sea and sky blended gently together. Browner stood watching from the shore. Then, almost without conscious thought, he hired another boat. He launched it quietly. Keeping some distance behind, he began rowing after them. Holmes rested the confession briefly upon his knee. The mist proved decisive, because it concealed them and everyone else. The detective looked toward me. Within a remarkably short distance from shore, they found themselves almost entirely alone. Browner continued rowing. The steady movement of his oars gradually closed the distance between the two boats. Ahead, Mary and Fairbairn remained unaware that anyone followed. The haze thickened. The voices from the shore disappeared. Only the gentle sound of water against the hulls remained. Holmes's voice became quieter still. It must have been an eerily peaceful scene. I could picture it vividly. Gray mist, calm water, two small boats drifting almost alone upon the sea. A place that should have offered only tranquility. Instead, it became the setting for irreversible tragedy. Little did I know where Browner's confession would lead. At last, the distance between them grew too small to escape notice. Fairbairn turned first. He recognized Browner immediately. Mary followed his gaze. Their expressions changed instantly. Holmes did not dwell upon dramatic detail. He merely described the moment with quiet restraint. Browner writes that both understood at once why he had come. No further explanation was necessary. The confession stated that Fairbairn attempted to defend himself. He seized one of the oars and tried to keep Browner's boat away. A brief struggle followed upon the water. Then Browner's heavy walking stick struck him. Only once. Fairbairn collapsed. The detective lowered the papers. The blow proved fatal. Silence filled the room. The fire gave fudgers. Outside, the distant church bell marked another passing hour. Holmes continued only after several moments. Browner confessed that even then he might perhaps have stopped. His anger had been directed chiefly toward Fairbairn, but before he could withdraw, Mary threw herself toward the fallen man. She called his name. She knelt beside him. She wrapped her arms around him. To Browner, already blinded by jealousy, that single act seemed to confirm every terrible suspicion he had carried for so many months. Reason vanished completely. The second blow followed almost immediately. Holmes spoke those words very quietly. There was no need for further description. The dreadful truth was plain enough. For a long time, neither of us moved. For found myself staring into the fire without truly seeing it. The sadness of the confession seemed far greater than its violence. Holmes finally resumed. Browner repeatedly states that he scarcely remembered what happened afterward. He acted almost automatically. He secured both bodies within the little boat. Then, using his knife, he carried out the dreadful threat he had once spoken during an argument with Sarah Cushing. The detective did not linger upon that part of the confession. Instead, he continued with respectful restraint. Browner then deliberately damaged the boat. Remaining nearby, he watched until it slowly filled with water and disappeared beneath the surface. To anyone discovering the empty shore, it would appear that two unfortunate visitors had vanished at sea. The haze would explain everything. Or, so he believed. The confession ended that part of the story with one final journey. Browner calmly returned to land. He cleaned himself carefully. He walked back to the docks. Then he rejoined the Mayday before the vessel resumed its voyage. No one aboard suspected anything unusual. To every appearance, he remained an ordinary steward, beginning another routine crossing. Only he carried the knowledge of what had happened upon the quiet waters beyond New Brighton. Holmes folded the last page slowly. He then prepared the parcel. The ears, yes. He packed them carefully in salt, tied the box, addressed it to Miss Sarah Cushing, and posted it from Belfast. Holmes nodded. He believed he was sending her the consequences of her own interference. The detective remained silent. The fire had almost burned itself low. The room glowed softly beneath the lamplight, while the familiar comfort of Baker Street seemed strangely distant beside the sorrowful events he had just heard. Only one final chapter remained. Holmes still wished to reflect upon what the tragedy truly meant, and upon the remarkable lesson he believed the case had left behind. That final reflection would remain with me long after every other detail of the investigation had faded from memory. For several quiet minutes after Holmes laid aside James Browner's confession, neither of us spoke. The fire had burned low, leaving only glowing embers beneath the blackened logs. Their gentle warmth filled our sitting room with a peaceful glow that seemed almost timeless. Outside, Baker Street rested beneath the calm of the late evening. A solitary cab rolled slowly over the stones before fading into the distance, leaving only silence behind. At length, I broke it. Holmes remained gazing into the fire. Yes, there was no triumph in solving it. No clever criminal brought to justice. No brilliant escape. He slowly shook his head. Only lives gradually broken. His voice carried an unusual gentleness. In many investigations, Watson, the crime begins on a particular day. He paused. In this one, it began months before anyone realized it. I reflected upon every person whose name had appeared in Browner's confession. There seems enough blame for everyone. Holmes nodded thoughtfully. That is often the nature of human tragedy. He counted quietly upon his fingers. Browner allowed drink to master him. Mary allowed suspicion to replace trust. Sarah allowed wounded pride to become bitterness. Fairbairn displayed very poor judgment. He lowered his hand. No single mistake destroyed them. It was the accumulation. Exactly. He looked toward me. A wall rarely falls because of one cracked stone. It weakens little by little until one final weight brings everything down. I reached for the confession once more. There is one point which still interests me. Holmes smiled faintly. I suspected there might be. Did Browner truly believe Sarah responsible? I think so. He blamed her almost entirely. Yes. Was he correct? Holmes remained silent for several moments before answering, not entirely. No. Sarah undoubtedly poisoned Mary's confidence. He folded his hands. Jealousy had already found fertile ground. You mean Browner himself? I do. He chose anger. He chose drink. He chose drink. He chose violence. Holmes spoke quietly. No one placed those choices into his hands. His words were firm, yet free from harshness. The influences around us may be powerful, but responsibility remains our own. The fire settled softly, with a quiet crackle. I found myself thinking not only of Browner, but of Mary, poor Mary Browner. In Holmes's careful summary of the confession, she had appeared neither wicked nor innocent. Beyond all fault, she had simply seemed human. Gentle woman who had gradually become frightened, uncertain, and lonely. I feel especially sorry for Mrs. Browner, I said. So do I, Holmes answered without hesitation. She appears to have loved her husband. I believe she did. And yet she feared him. Holmes nodded sadly. The two emotions often exist together. He looked thoughtfully into the dying fire. It is one of life's cruelest contradictions. After another quiet pause, I asked, "And Sarah?" Holmes leaned back. I suspect she punished herself long before the law ever could. The shock. Yes. The parcel. Precisely. He recalled their brief visit to Wallington. The moment she learned of the cardboard box, she immediately understood its meaning. She recognized the message. And the ears? Holmes nodded. She knew exactly whose they were. The illness was genuine. I never doubted it. He sighed quietly. There are wounds no physician can easily heal. I remembered Miss Susan Cushing sitting peacefully beside her embroidery frame. She had known nothing at all. By mere chance, the dreadful parcel had reached her quiet home instead of her sister's. What became of Miss Susan? I asked. Holmes smiled gently. I imagine she returned to her peaceful life. I hope so. As do I. He reached for his pipe. She deserved no share in the suffering. No. Only an unfortunate mistake placed her at the center of the affair. Ramon grew comfortably warm once more as Holmes relit his pipe. Loose smoke drifted lazily upward, mingling with the last glow from the fireplace. He remained unusually reflective. Do you remember, Watson, how the case began? With your reading my thoughts? He smiled. A small demonstration. It seemed astonishing at the time. It now appears rather insignificant. Compared with everything that followed, it truly did. Holmes continued. People often imagine that deduction exists only to expose criminals, but that is too narrow a view. What else does it reveal? He answered quietly. It reveals people, their fears, their hopes, their weaknesses, and sometimes, he added softly, their sorrows. I looked at your familiar window overlooking Baker Street. The curtains moved gently in the cool night breeze. The city beyond seemed wonderfully peaceful. Yet somewhere within those countless streets, lived thousands of ordinary families, each carrying unseen burdens known only to themselves. Holmes followed my gaze. London never lacks mysteries. No, but many of its greatest mysteries never reach Scotland Yard. He spoke almost to himself. They remain hidden within ordinary homes, behind ordinary doors, in ordinary hearts. Those words remained with me long after he had spoken them. Little did I know that they would become one of the lessons I remembered most clearly from our years together. The following morning brought another brief note from Lestrade. Holmes read it over breakfast before handing it to me. The inspector reported that James Browner remained entirely cooperative. He had repeated his confession before the magistrate without altering a single detail. Searches conducted near New Brighton had already confirmed the principal facts of his statement. The little rowing boat had indeed disappeared beneath the water. Other evidence supported the account he had given. There will be little difficulty now, Holmes observed. The law has what it requires. He folded the letter. Though I doubt any sentence pronounced in court will exceed the punishment Browner has already endured. I remembered the words from his confession, the sleepless nights, the faces that appeared whenever he closed his eyes, the burden of memory. Perhaps Holmes was right. Several days later, I asked Holmes whether he intended to publish an account of the investigation. He smiled. I leave that privilege to you. I wonder whether readers will believe it. They may. They may not. He shrugged lightly. It matters very little. Matters, then, that the lesson survives. Holmes rested one elbow upon the arm of his chair. That reason must govern passion, always, as often as humanly possible. He smiled faintly. Passion is a magnificent servant, but a disastrous master. As the years passed, many greater mysteries occupied our attention. Kings sought Holmes's advice. Foreign governments quietly consulted him. Jewels disappeared. Secret papers changed hands. Lives were saved. Empires, on occasion, were spared embarrassment. Yet, among all those remarkable adventures, the affair of the cardboard box continued to return to my thoughts, not because it contained Holmes' most astonishing deduction, nor because it involved the most ingenious criminal. I remembered it because it reminded me how easily ordinary happiness may be lost. A careless word, a hidden resentment, a suspicion left to grow, a weakness ignored. Each seemed small when viewed alone. Together, they proved stronger than love itself. Whenever I think of James Browner, I do not first remember the courtroom or the prison cell. I remember, instead, a devoted husband walking home unexpectedly, carrying nothing but the hope of surprising his wife. Whenever I think of Mary Browner, I remember not the lonely boat upon the sea, but the cheerful young woman smiling beside her husband in the old photograph that rested upon her sister's table. And whenever I think of Sherlock Holmes, I remember not merely the brilliance with which he untangled the mystery, but the quiet compassion that remained hidden beneath his extraordinary mind. Many believed Holmes incapable of emotion. They knew only the detective. I had the privilege of knowing the man. He rarely displayed sympathy in words. Instead, it appeared in quieter ways, in the gentleness of his questions, the fairness of his judgments, at his refusal to mock even those whose greatest enemy had become their own human weakness. That perhaps was the finest lesson I learned during all our years together. The world often remembers Sherlock Holmes for his remarkable powers of observation. I remember him equally for his understanding of the human heart, and so ends the curious and deeply sorrowful affair of the cardboard box. Its mystery was solved, its criminal was found. Yet no victory could restore the lives that had been lost, nor heal every heart that had been broken. Such are cases that remain longest in memory, not because justice was difficult to achieve, but because justice alone could never make the world whole again. Until we meet again, my dear friend, good night.